The grass shifted gently with the afternoon wind, folding and unfolding around the still shape hidden within it, as if the land itself were unsure how to respond. From a distance, the lion blended into the muted gold of the savanna, his mane dulled with dust, his powerful frame pressed low against the earth. Only when the rangers slowed their vehicle and let silence settle did they notice the faint rise and fall of his ribs, uneven and shallow, barely disturbing the stems around him. He did not lift his head. His ears did not turn. His tail lay slack behind him, tangled in brittle stalks. A fly moved freely across his muzzle and he did not flinch. Years of instinct had taught him to hide weakness, to retreat quietly when pain arrived, to wait until either strength returned or breath finally stopped. Now he lay in that narrow space between both, suspended in exhaustion, his amber eyes half open but unfocused, reflecting nothing in particular. The rangers remained seated for a long moment, hands resting loosely on their knees, listening to the faint rhythm of air moving in and out of his chest. One of them lowered binoculars slowly, careful not to let the click of metal disturb the stillness. A thin, dark line traced along the lion's shoulder, half hidden by mane and dust, old blood mixed with fresh, suggesting a wound that had never fully closed. Each breath seemed to pull against it, tightening and releasing like strained fabric. When the lion shifted slightly, it was not a movement of strength but of discomfort, a slow curl of his paw inward, claws barely scraping soil. A quiet voice slipped into the open air, barely louder than the wind. "Easy boy," one ranger murmured, more for reassurance than instruction. The lion's ear twitched once, a small reflex, not acknowledgement, and then fell still again. They did not approach. They did not reach for equipment or radios. Instead, they chose to remain where they were, letting time stretch around them. The sun continued its gradual descent, softening shadows, warming the dust that clung to their boots and to the lion's fur alike. Insects hummed and paused. Somewhere far off, a herd shifted, hooves tapping faintly against dry ground. The injured lion's breathing wavered, sometimes slowing to the edge of stopping, then catching again in a fragile rhythm. His eyes closed for several seconds at a time, reopening only when a sharper wave of pain passed through him. Each reopening was slower than the last, as if lifting invisible weight. One ranger eased the vehicle engine off, allowing complete quiet to settle. Another rested a hand lightly against the door, grounding himself in stillness. They understood that intervention would come later, if it came at all, but this moment required something simpler and harder: patience. Staying meant witnessing his struggle without rushing to shape its outcome. It meant honoring the dignity of an animal who had survived seasons of drought and conflict alone, now facing vulnerability in open grass. As the light thinned and the sky softened toward evening, the lion released a low, breathy sound, not a roar, not a call, just air passing over tired lungs. The grass leaned with the breeze. Dust floated briefly, then fell. And in that quiet stretch between daylight and dusk, life continued to hold on, fragile and unresolved, waiting. As the light thinned and softened, drifting from pale gold toward muted amber, the details that had been hidden by distance and glare slowly emerged. Shadows pulled back from the lion's body, revealing the uneven rise of muscle beneath his fur, the places where swelling distorted familiar lines of strength. Along his flank, several deep scratches crossed in irregular patterns, some darkened with dried blood, others faintly moist where healing had never fully settled. One hind leg rested at an awkward angle, the joint thickened and tender, refusing to fold naturally beneath his weight. Every few minutes, a tremor moved through it, small and involuntary, the body's quiet response to persistent pain. The rangers watched without urgency, reading these signs the way trackers learn to read sand and wind. Hunger showed itself in the hollowness of his ribs, the way skin pulled tightly over bone, in the dullness of eyes that had once scanned kilometers of open land for movement. Days without successful hunting had left him weakened, unable to pursue prey, unable to defend territory, unable even to move far from this patch of grass where exhaustion had finally pinned him down. Yet he remained alert in his own restrained way. When a bird passed overhead, his pupils shifted slightly. When wind carried unfamiliar scents, his nostrils flared, testing the air. Instinct still lived within him even as strength faded. At times he lifted his head an inch or two, only to lower it again when effort proved too heavy. Each attempt seemed negotiated with his own body, as though he were measuring pain against necessity, choosing stillness more often than motion. When one ranger shifted his foot, the faint crunch of dry soil reached the lion's ears. His gaze turned slowly, not sharply, resting on the distant figures. No growl followed. No defensive display rose from his chest. There was only a quiet, watchful uncertainty, the wary calculation of an animal too tired to flee yet unwilling to surrender awareness. The rangers answered that gaze with stillness. They kept their movements wide and slow, hands visible, posture low. One of them rested his elbow on his knee and spoke barely above breath. "We're here," he said softly, not as a promise but as presence. The words floated and settled into the grass without demanding response. The lion blinked once, slowly, lids meeting and parting with effort. It was not trust, not acceptance, but something gentler and more fragile. Tolerance born from exhaustion, a momentary suspension of fear. Time stretched. Sunlight slid across fur and dust, tracing the curve of his spine, the rise of his shoulders. A beetle crossed his paw. He did not react. His breathing remained uneven but steady enough to continue. Occasionally he shifted his weight, searching for a position that did not aggravate swollen joints. Each movement was careful, economical, conserving what little energy remained. Distance became its own language. The rangers did not shorten it. They allowed space to serve as reassurance, as proof that nothing would be taken from him without necessity. In that wide circle of quiet, something delicate formed, not built on touch or command but on shared patience. As evening approached and long shadows stretched across the grass, the lion rested his head fully against the earth again, eyes half closed, body still listening. And nearby, the rangers remained, breathing with him, holding space for whatever strength might return. The evening settled slowly, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile balance that had formed in the grass. Hours had passed in near silence, marked only by shifting light and the steady presence of breath. The lion had not moved far, but small changes revealed themselves to those who watched closely. His head no longer lifted at every distant sound. His ears drooped slightly to the sides. Once in a while, a low, uncertain sound escaped his throat, not a roar, not a call for territory, but something quieter, thinner, shaped by fatigue more than intention. It drifted briefly into the air and faded, leaving no echo behind. The rangers recognized it as a sign. Not distress alone, and not surrender, but the subtle signal of an animal reaching the limits of endurance. They exchanged no words. One of them slowly rose from his place beside the vehicle, careful to let each movement unfold in full view. He paused after standing, allowing the lion time to register the change. No sudden alarm followed. The lion's eyes opened wider for a moment, tracking the figure, then softened again, blinking once as if effort itself had become expensive. Step by measured step, the ranger moved forward, boots brushing grass without lifting dust. He kept his body angled slightly sideways, avoiding a direct line that might feel confrontational. Every few paces he stopped. Each pause was an offering of space, a reminder that approach did not mean pursuit. When he reached a distance close enough to see the fine cracks in the lion's whiskers and the faint tremble in his jaw, he knelt slowly, lowering himself to the animal's level. The lion responded with a small shift of his head, lifting it barely from the ground. His chest tightened, breath quickening for several seconds, then settling again. His gaze remained fixed on the ranger's hands, watching for sudden motion. There was no attempt to rise. No baring of teeth. His strength was invested in awareness alone. A quiet voice moved gently through the air. "It's all right," the ranger whispered, more rhythm than meaning. The words were soft enough to blend with wind and insects, part of the landscape rather than an intrusion. From a small pack, he withdrew medical supplies, unwrapping them slowly, letting each sound exist without surprise. Clean water glistened briefly in fading light. A cloth darkened as it absorbed dust and dried blood. When the ranger reached out for the first time, he did so with hesitation, stopping inches from fur, waiting. The lion did not recoil. His muscles tightened briefly, then released. Permission, fragile and incomplete, rested in that stillness. Contact was light, almost uncertain. The cloth touched his shoulder, lifting debris, cooling inflamed skin. The lion exhaled sharply once, then relaxed, head lowering again. His tail moved a few centimeters, not in agitation but adjustment. Swollen joints were examined gently, pressure minimal, hands guided by reaction rather than assumption. Each wince, each subtle flinch, was answered by retreat, by patience. Other rangers remained where they were, silent witnesses, anchors of calm. No restraint was used. No force was needed. The lion allowed proximity not through trust, but through understanding that no harm followed it. In that narrowing window of light, human and animal shared a fragile agreement shaped by exhaustion and respect. As darkness gathered at the edges of the plain, treatment continued in careful intervals. The wind passed softly through grass and mane alike. Somewhere far away, night creatures began to stir. And in that quiet space between fear and relief, a wounded lion rested under gentle hands, holding still long enough to be helped. The work concluded without ceremony, as gently as it had begun. Bandages lay secured against torn flesh, medication absorbed slowly into strained muscle, and water had been offered in small, careful amounts. The ranger withdrew his hands at last, easing backward inch by inch, restoring the distance that had made safety possible. The lion remained where he was, chest rising and falling in deeper rhythms now, breath no longer catching at every turn. His eyes stayed open, following the retreating figure until space had been fully returned. For several minutes nothing else changed. The grass whispered quietly. Insects gathered and drifted away. The sky deepened into muted violet and blue, stretching wide above the plains. Then, at the far edge of vision, movement appeared. It was not sudden. It did not announce itself. Shapes emerged gradually from tall grass and shadow, resolving into familiar forms, sleek bodies, attentive postures, heads lifted into the wind. Members of the pride had come, drawn by scent, by instinct, by the subtle absence that had lingered for days. They stopped at a respectful distance. No charge followed. No warning calls broke the stillness. Tails flicked slowly. Ears turned forward, then sideways, testing sounds and air. Their eyes rested first on the injured lion, then briefly on the quiet figures nearby, then returned to him again. Assessment unfolded in silence. The rangers did not move. Engines remained cold. Human presence became part of the landscape, neither challenge nor invitation. The injured lion sensed them before fully seeing them. His breathing shifted. His head lifted higher than it had in hours, neck muscles tightening with effort. His ears angled toward the distant forms. A low sound gathered in his chest, hesitant, unfinished at first. He paused, breath trembling as though unsure whether strength remained for more. Then, slowly he pushed against the ground. The movement was uneven and deliberate. One foreleg found purchase. The swollen hind joint resisted, then complied under careful redistribution of weight. His body rose in stages, trembling lightly, mane slipping forward across his shoulders. For a moment he stood uncertainly, balance wavering. Dust fell from his fur in fine threads. The rangers held their breath without meaning to. Once steadied, he drew in a deeper breath and released it as a low, resonant call. It was not the thunderous roar of dominance or territory. It was softer, drawn from within fatigue and recognition, carrying across grass and distance like a thread of sound. It traveled outward and waited. From the far edge of the plain an answer returned. Another low call followed, then another, layered and calm. One lioness stepped forward slightly, then stopped. A younger male shifted closer to her side. Their responses were steady, unhurried, woven with familiarity rather than alarm. The injured lion lowered his head briefly as if grounding himself, then lifted it again, gaze fixed on his family. His tail moved once in a slow arc. Around him, the evening continued its quiet descent. The last warmth of day lingered on fur and soil. Wind moved through grass like water. The rangers remained still, witnesses to a reunion shaped not by drama, but by patience and survival. As darkness gathered and stars began their slow appearance, the pride held its gentle formation, and a wounded lion stood among them again, answering and answered, held by the quiet language of belonging. The distance between them narrowed without urgency. One by one the members of the pride moved forward, their steps measured, bodies low and relaxed. They did not crowd him. They formed a loose arc instead, surrounding without enclosing, offering presence without pressure. A lioness brushed close enough for her shoulder to briefly touch his flank, the contact light and deliberate. He leaned into it for a moment, redistributing weight, drawing strength from the steady warmth beside him. Another followed, walking just behind his injured leg, adjusting pace to match his uneven rhythm. The lion began to move. Each step unfolded slowly, placed with care, guided by instinct and pain alike. His injured joints stiffened with every lift, then softened slightly as weight settled again. Dust rose in faint clouds around his paws and drifted away. The grass parted and closed behind him, erasing the narrow path almost as soon as it formed. He did not hurry. There was no need. The presence of his pride shaped the space around him, creating a corridor of quiet protection. After several meters he paused. Muscles trembled beneath his mane as he rested. His chest expanded deeply, then released. For a long moment he stood without turning, eyes forward, ears listening. Then slowly he looked back. His gaze passed over the empty patch of ground where the rangers had remained for hours. It lingered on the outline of the vehicle, now softened by shadow and distance. There was no expression to read, no meaning to assign. Only awareness. Recognition of a moment that had altered the direction of his path, however briefly. His tail lifted slightly, then settled. Behind him, the Rangers had already begun to withdraw. They moved with the same restraint that had guided them all day, steps quiet, bodies angled away, leaving no sudden absence. One paused once, placing a hand against the cool metal of the door, grounding himself before climbing inside. No words were exchanged. None were needed. What had passed between them and the lion belonged to silence, not explanation. The engine started softly, then faded as the vehicle rolled back along a barely visible track. Dust lifted, hovered, and fell. The sound thinned until it merged with wind and distant insects. Human presence dissolved into the wider rhythm of the plains. Ahead, the Pride continued forward. They moved toward open grasslands where moonlight would soon stretch across endless space, where prey would return in time, where strength could be rebuilt through rest and companionship. The injured lion walked at the center of them now, no longer isolated, no longer hidden. His steps remained uneven, but they carried him onward. As they reached taller grass, their bodies blended once more into the landscape. Gold and shadow intertwined. Shapes softened. One by one they disappeared from view, absorbed by the terrain that had shaped them. Only faint impressions remained in the soil, overlapping tracks, slightly deeper where weight had leaned for support, lighter where strength had returned. Wind moved through the stems, smoothing edges, scattering scent. Somewhere far away night birds called. And where pain and patience had once met in stillness, the savanna closed gently around the memory, leaving nothing behind but quiet, and the slow, endless breathing of the land.